I never thought my parents, who doted on my genius sister, would ever say I was unnecessary.
One child is enough for us. We don't need you, the underachiever.
Saying so, my parents kicked me out while I was just a kid. The one who reached out to me in my confusion was my uncle.
Sorry I'm not well off, but let's live together.
I took his hand without hesitation. My name is Emily. I'm currently 30 years old, but I have a complex past. It's all about family issues. But first, I want you to hear my story. I was born into a typical family, with a father working as a company employee and a stay-at-home mother. We lived with my paternal grandparents at their home, where my father's unmarried brother, who was my Uncle George, also lived. We started living together when I was 4 years old, and George was 24. Being single and living at the parents' house at around the age of 24 might not be considered unusual. But George had a reason he couldn't leave his parents' house. As a child, I didn't know the details, but it seems George had been frail since he was young. Even as an adult, he was often sick and couldn't hold down a job for long. As a result, he became a part-timer, able to work only a few hours, 2 days a week at most. He certainly couldn't earn enough for living on his own. Maybe he felt ashamed for still depending on his parents at his age because he always looked apologetic.
Really, you're such a burden.
My father often yelled at George, and I frequently witnessed it. Always when the grandparents weren't around. My grandparents loved their healthy son and their frail son equally, without favoritism. The cohabitation started because of my father's financial difficulties, so my father, who was also dependent on his parents, probably wanted to show some restraint in front of them. But when the grandparents weren't there, he always said terrible things to George, looked down on him, and snickered. George, with a sad face, never got angry or talked back. He just stayed silent.
Why don't you get angry?
I once asked him as a child.
It's true that I'm depending on my parents.
He answered with a troubled look. As a child, I thought that made sense, but now that I'm an adult, I think Dad is also depending on them. So he's not in a position to say anything. If I had understood that back then, I would have stood up for George. As a child who didn't understand, even though I felt bad when my father yelled at George, I couldn't say anything. Even though things were tense behind the scenes without my grandparents around, their presence brought peace. In front of my grandparents, George would relax and smile. And my father, regardless of his true feelings, never showed them. My mother was too busy caring for me and my sister Lucy, who was 2 years younger, to pay much attention to the relationship between my father and uncle. As a kid, I thought this routine would last forever. But then, everything changed abruptly. My grandparents died in an accident when I was 6 years old. Their passing left me incredibly sad and lonely. I cried a lot. My sister Lucy and I bawled together. I vividly remember George quietly shedding tears too. But what I remember most, something unforgettable, was my father's laughter. Yes, my father laughed. Despite his own parents' death, he didn't shed a tear, not when we rushed to the hospital, not during the funeral preparations. It wasn't about being stoic. Even as a child, I understood my father wasn't grieving. And then I became certain of it. On the day of the funeral, my father was laughing. He probably thought no one was watching, but I happened to look at him and saw his expression clearly. It wasn't laughter from overwhelming sadness or confusion. I could tell because I'm his daughter. It was a smile of genuine, unbearable joy. My father was happy about my grandparents' death. He probably thought of the various inheritances coming his way. His smile was so grotesque that it scared me, a child, into crying. He must have thought those were tears for my grandparents' passing. George gently patted my head and stroked it. Looking up, I saw his eyes, red from crying but filled with a kind light, looking down at me.
How could Dad and George, real brothers, react so differently to their parents' passing?
It was a moment my unease towards my dad grew. Then, my father's behavior towards George drastically changed. First, my father's attitude towards George became noticeably hostile.
Why should I have to take care of a good-for-nothing like you? Be grateful I let you live here. If you can't pay rent or anything, I'm taking all the inheritance.
At the time, I didn't understand, but it was an utterly unreasonable declaration. Despite having a right to an equal share of the inheritance as brothers, my father claimed it all for himself as the head of the family. George could have stood up for himself or sought legal help. But he did nothing of the sort. Even though he looked sad, he never argued back or claimed his share of the inheritance.
Are you okay, babe?
Worried about my increasingly downcast George, I asked.
I'm frail and can hardly work, so it can't be helped.
He said with a weak smile. Day by day, as my father hurled abuse at him, my frail George became thinner and his complexion worsened. Yet, George always smiled at me.
It's okay.
Always. But 3 months after my grandparents passed away, George was ultimately kicked out of the house.
Get out, you good-for-nothing.
He was told, and without any objection or resistance, he left.
George, I don't want you to go.
I was sad about the farewell to my kind George and pulled on his arm, but he gently removed my hand and patted my head.
It's okay, Emily. You're a strong girl. You'll be all right without me.
But you won't be okay, will you?
George, frail and unable to work properly. How was he going to survive on his own?
It's okay.
With tears in his eyes, he looked at me and said that before he left. The separation from George was sad, but there was nothing a child like me could do. Moreover, I soon found myself in a situation where I couldn't afford to worry about someone else. 2 years after my grandparents passed away, I was just a regular 8-year-old attending elementary school. And then, when my sister Lucy turned 6 and was about to start elementary school.
In kindergarten, they said Lucy is really smart.
That's what my mother started to say, and it was the beginning of everything.
She might be a genius like me.
My father was over the moon, and he impulsively decided to have her take an IQ test. And the result was astonishing.
IQ 150. Definitely got my genes.
Turns out, she scored an impressive IQ of 150. I didn't fully grasp it, but I understood my sister must be something special.
Wow, Lucy, that's amazing.
Thanks, Emily.
Not really getting it, I praised her, and she beamed with joy. Those were the good days. Until then, everything was fine. But then it all went downhill.
All right, Let's get her into a good school.
My father declared, ready to act on his spur-of-the-moment decision.
Starting now.
Even my mother was surprised, but was swept up by father's inexplicable confidence.
She's a genius. She'll be fine.
And with that, my mother got on board too. Then, my sister started going to tutoring every day. Since it's my mother who's accompanying my sister, naturally, household chores tend to get neglected. Then my father brought it up.
Hey, since your mom and Lucy are busy, take care of the house yourself.
He said that to me. And that's how laundry and cleaning fell to me. After school, hanging out with friends wasn't an option. I had to head straight home to do chores, or I'd get yelled at by my parents. If I didn't do them right, there were days I'd be skipped for dinner.
We don't have time to take care of a failure like you.
I was told.
Why can't you score perfect marks?
I was yelled at by my father for bringing home a test with a score in the 90s.
Just try to be a little more like your sister Lucy.
My mother said, exasperated. Even if I scored well on tests or came first in the sports day, my parents wouldn't notice or praise me, just ignored me. They'd mechanically tell me to learn from your sister Lucy. And then they started saying things like this.
Well, it's hopeless for you. Lucy is a genius, but you're just incompetent.
Lucy really was a genius, rapidly advancing in her studies with just a short period of tutoring, and passed the entrance exams with ease. As that happened, my parents became even colder towards me. They spent money on Lucy. I wasn't given new clothes and had to struggle wearing the ones that had become too small. Lucy got to eat delicious food. I got leftovers. Lucy was taken on trips. I had to stay home. My parents blatantly doted only on Lucy.
This kid's gonna be a big shot someday. Then our retirement will be smooth sailing.
My father would say, laughing.
A doctor, maybe, or a lawyer, even aiming to be a politician wouldn't be bad.
Having a genius daughter, we're super lucky.
I was invisible in my parents' eyes. My existence, crying in Lucy's shadow, was forgotten. Then, when I was 10, my parents finally said,
We don't need you because the education for Lucy costs a lot.
What?
Confused by what that meant, my father said,
We're saying one child, Lucy, is enough.
You mean to live on my own? How on earth?
Well, I'll at least give you your uncle's contact. Take some money and figure it out on your own.
And with that, I was really given just a small amount of money and kicked out of the house. Crying and pleading to be let back in, I banged on the front door, but there was no response. The door remained closed. In despair, I headed to the station. Being 10 years old, I had enough knowledge to ride the train. Asking people for directions, somehow I made it to George's apartment. When he answered the bell, he had the same kind face I remembered. He was shocked to see me and let me in, and when I told him what happened, he was furious.
What are they thinking? No kidding.
Even though it wasn't me he was angry at, I felt so sorry and depressed. Wondering if I was just a burden, tears started to well up in my eyes. Then, a hand was gently placed on my drooping head. It was the same large, warm, kind hand I remembered.
It's been tough, huh? It's going to be okay now.
But what should I do now?
I'm still prone to illness, and my income is low, as you can see. I'm poor.
George said with a wry smile in front of me. But he seemed much stronger than when we lived together before. Maybe being away from my father had brought some change in his mindset. Looking straight at me, George smiled and said,
I'm sorry for being poor, but if you don't mind, I'd be happy to become your parent.
Really?
More like a foster dad in this case, I guess. I might not be much, but...
Before he could finish, I threw myself into his big chest. It was similar to my dad's, yet entirely different. George's embrace was incredibly comforting.
It's going to be okay now.
As I cried with relief, George gently stroked my back. It felt like having a real parent who poured love into me. From then on, I was raised by George. Sure, he was poor and still prone to sickness, and life was tough at times. But even in poverty, our home was filled with smiles. I had almost forgotten how to smile when I was with my parents, but living with George, I began to smile a lot. A poor yet happy family. That's what we were. George gave me so much love. Wanting to repay his kindness, I did my best in everything. When I worked hard, George praised me. Even if the outcomes were poor, he praised the effort. That made me even more determined to do my best. The presence of my parents, who never praised me, eventually faded from my memory. Growing up under George's care, 20 years flew by in no time. Now, I am 30 years old. And now, the familiar faces stand in front of me. Mom, Dad.
It's been a while, Emily. Have you been living well?
The one smiling is my father, whom I pushed to the far corners of my memory. He's aged considerably, with hardly any hair left. My gaze towards him is icy. It's only natural, thinking, what do you want now?
Well, let's put the past behind us and get along as a family from now on.
Despite my icy gaze, my father said this without flinching. What? Naturally, this was my response. What? Get along as a family. Don't joke with me.
You really are a failure. Always had a bad mouth. No help for it. I'll start re-educating you from now.
No, thank you. Please leave. I push back my father as he tries to enter the apartment. And then my mother joined in.
Emily, don't be stubborn. Rely on us. Living in such a run-down apartment, you mustn't be leading a decent life.
It's none of your business. Please leave.
Don't be stubborn. Just let us in.
No, leave.
Let us in.
Go away. What's with them? If my memory serves right, they are in their mid-50s. Their strength should be waning, yet they are unexpectedly forceful. No, it makes sense. 2 against 1. I'm obviously going to be overpowered. It reminds me of those days playing foot wrestling as a kid. As I was musing, my father's foot reached the entrance. Heave-ho! I pushed back with all my might, like a foot wrestler.
Whoa.
Oh my gosh.
Caught off guard, both of them fell to the ground. Accordingly, I ended up looking down on them. You're so annoying.
What?
I'm busy. Can't you just go home?
What kind of way is that to speak? What do you think of your parents?
The moment you abandoned me, I never thought of you as my parents.
But we raised you till you were 10.
Till I was 10, huh? The only decent upbringing I had was when my grandparents were still alive.
But you were still able to live, weren't you?
That's no reason for you to act whole high and mighty. As my parents stood up, rubbing their backs, they seemed to have shrunk in size. Even though they're just in their 50s, they looked aged beyond, almost like they were in their 70s. You said it yourself, didn't you? One child, Lucy, was enough. With a genius sister like that, there's no need for you to come see me.
That's not the case anymore.
My words twisted my father's face into a bitter grimace. Did something happen to Lucy? Did she become jobless?
She became a lawyer.
Well, that's great. Impressive, really. IQ 150 and all.
And then she disappeared.
Impressive indeed. As the story goes, Lucy smoothly entered law school, took the bar exam after graduate school. She didn't pass on her first try but eventually succeeded. It's a bit beyond me, but she completed her training and officially became a lawyer, or so they say. And yet, she vanished.
She said, "I won't take care of you two," and left.
Well, so you were abandoned. Congratulations.
Not congratulatory at all. That ungrateful girl, repaying our upbringing with betrayal.
Well, there was no love, was there? My parents thought they were doting on my sister, but from her perspective, it probably just felt suffocating. Parents who change completely based on an IQ number. Parents who placed excessive expectations. Parents who disguised their desires as love, pushing them onto her. No wonder Lucy got fed up.
My company went bankrupt.
Tough economy, huh?
There's hardly any severance pay, and the unemployment benefits are about to run out.
Good for you?
Not good at all. But it's too late to start over at a new company now.
Too hard, huh? I couldn't help but laugh at the lack of enthusiasm.
So, you need to take care of us.
The laughter dies instantly. No, I don't.
What? You're going to abandon your parents.
The only parent I have is George, who has been taking care of me since I was 10.
What?
My father looks bewildered by my words. Coming to this apartment means you knew I was living with George, right? What's there to be surprised about now?
You think of him as your parent.
The George who showered me with love. He's my dad. You two never gave me any love, so you're not my parents. My parents looked at me in astonishment. Despite his frail health, George worked hard. He struggled so I wouldn't have to. I worked really hard to repay that kindness.
So, you're doing some decent work.
Sort of. As I shrugged, my father grabbed my shoulder tightly. Let go.
So, you're angry and you're embarrassed. Oh,
Listen to what I'm saying.
no need to say more. I understand perfectly. You were feeling lonely, huh? And now you're sulking. That's right. Always being not favored because of your sister. No wonder you're sulking. But now that you're with us, you're all happy and bashful. So, you're emotionally closed off.
Don't make things up.
Relax. From now on, we'll be together as a family.
I couldn't make sense of it. Is my father already suffering from dementia? I stared blankly at my parents for a moment, gradually finding their foolish faces amusing.
What are you laughing at? Happy, aren't you?
No way. Just so you know, I haven't thought about you guys once in these past 10 years. Thanks to George, I've been living very fulfilling days. My parents were shocked by my sudden laughter, but I continued. I went to university through a scholarship program.
Oh, you did. Then you must have gotten a good job.
Yes, I got a job at a pretty famous corporation.
Well, ain't that something?
And I got married through some connections.
Oh, then we must greet your husband.
No need.
Yes, we must.
It's impossible. He's abroad right now.
Oh, yeah.
Just so you know, George is also abroad.
George too. Really? What does that mean? I thought given you were living here alone, and given how frail he must have been, he may have passed away by now.
Don't just assume George is dead. My husband got an overseas assignment, heard it was a good place for recuperation, so George went along. He's completely recovered and is happily playing with my children.
Wait, you have our grandchildren.
The rapid influx of information seems to have nearly short-circuited my parents' brains. As they blinked in confusion, I smiled brightly at them. At first, George was hesitant about living together with us, but he eventually agreed. We're all living happily together as a family.
Then, maybe we could go abroad too.
That's fine, but we won't live together or take care of you. Live on your own money.
That's impossible. Are you abandoning your parents?
You were the ones who abandoned me first. I finally snapped at their utterly selfish reasoning. My parents turned pale. I owe nothing to you, who abandoned me, but I owe a great deal to George. I plan to repay his kindness.
Such. At least send us some money.
George never touched the money I sent him, and he lived in this rundown apartment all this time. But he finally agreed to live with me overseas, so I came to finalize things.
What?
To think you'd show up on the very last day I'm leaving this old place. What a coincidence.
Huh? So, you're leaving?
I've finished the paperwork, and I'm just about to return the keys. Then I'm heading back to my home overseas.
What about us? Are you abandoning your parents?
After my mother turned pale and asked, I nodded emphatically. Thank you for abandoning me. Saying so with a smile left them speechless. Really, thank you. Because of that, I'm truly happy now. With that, I walked past them. How does it feel, you who abandoned your daughter, to be abandoned by both your daughters? I asked one last question, but no reply came. I didn't wait for their answer and left, thinking this would be the real farewell with my biological parents. Afterwards, I returned to my home overseas. The effort I put in while living with George paid off. I managed to secure a job at a good company. Then, with an overseas assignment, I met a man and got married. George cried and blessed the marriage. And with the birth of our children and George joining us, I'm now living happily with my husband, my children, and my Uncle George.
And I wish I could find a wonderful man like your husband soon.
My sister Lucy says, laughing beside me as we watch the children play in the garden. Well, now that you're free from our parents' grip, I'm sure you'll find someone.
I need to get used to work first.
Why don't you try for a liar's license here?
I think I'll pass on being a lawyer. I've had enough of following our parents' orders. I want to pursue a career I'm passionate about.
That makes sense. Right after I was abandoned by our parents and left home, Lucy sent a letter to George. It contained complaints about our parents' twisted love and the pressure she was under. She wanted to come live with George too, but his financial situation couldn't support both of us. And most importantly, our parents wouldn't allow it. So, for the time being, we've arranged for her to live at our parents' home where she can get by, and we're making plans for her to move out once she's an adult. It was tough for her, but my sister managed to overcome the trials and gain her freedom. She left home taking advantage of the moment our parents were happy about her becoming a lawyer. Of course, I helped her with that. She secured a job here but is struggling with the language and adapting to new things. But I'm sure she'll be fine. My sister Lucy, she just kept on living under our parents' roof. I tell you, I've never known anyone as patient and hardworking as her. She'll surely adapt here soon. I'm more worried about George. George is going to language school, I mentioned, and Lucy nodded happily.
Sounds good. It's never too late to start something new. He seems to be in much better health now, so we need to make sure he enjoys life from here on out.
Indeed. Our parents, who had taken everything from George, including his inheritance, got carried away with their spending and quickly ran out of money. They desperately tried to invest in their daughters, but now they've hit unemployment. They went ahead and sold the house to make some money, but it turns out they had some kind of renovation loan or something tied to the house, so they were left with very little in hand. Our relatives have apparently been hit up for money, but everyone has coldly turned them away, forcing them into a life of poverty. A relative shared with a wry smile that the constant quarreling between them is unbearable. Looking down on siblings or discriminating against one child over another is just unthinkable.
Indeed.
Lucy nodded to my words. I'll always protect you, Lucy, no matter what.
I've already been protected enough by you. Thank you, Emily.
When I was moved by my sister's grown-up words.
What are you protecting?
A hand was placed on my head. It seemed to have more wrinkles and felt smaller, but as warm as ever, making me squint as I turned around. Thank you.
Huh?
Seeing George standing there with a puzzled look, I smiled and said, Thank you, Dad. I love you.